Hello everyone. A little over 2 weeks ago, Arrtx sent me 2 sets of acrylic markers. And in my last video, I shared unpackaging them, my first reaction, using them, as well as swatching them out and drawing some little portraits in my Ohuhu sketchbook. And over the last 2 weeks, on a daily basis, I have been drawing with them in my Talens sketchbook. And I want to share with you some of my learnings drawing every day in this little sketchbook, a Arrtx marker portrait. So one of the things I want to first talk about are the properties of acrylic paint. Right, because I think it's a nice lead-in into some of the how and why I decided to paint them. I typically paint with Liquitex. I think they're called the heavy body acrylics. And what I like about them is they're very pigmented and there's a wide variety of color choices. Really no right or wrong. There's a lot of different kind of brands out there. This is just the one that I stuck with. So one of the first things I want to mention is that not all paints are made equally, right? Some pigment in these acrylic paint are easier to come by, easier to craft, which yield a lower price point, right? And you can, so the way that you look at this is by the series, okay? So the lower the series, the cheaper it is. And the higher it is, the more expensive. I think this one little tube cost 30 to 40 Canadian dollars just for this one thing, versus I'm pretty sure I paid $10 for this whole tube, which is a lot bigger than this because this is series 1. Okay, the other thing I want to call out is in acrylic paint, not everything is opaque. I think that's a common misconception because when people are using these Posca markers, every single one of them is opaque, but that's actually not the case with acrylic. There are a ton of acrylic paints that's transparent. So these two are both opaque, but let me share with you an example that's not. A lot of blue paints, okay, are transparent, as you can see here. And this one is marked as semi-opaque. Most of the, I would say, blue and green shades, you will need to double check when you're purchasing acrylic paint because a lot of them are not fully opaque. And it's really hard to make a pigment that's blue to be fully opaque unless you add some white to it. Okay, so just put that out there. Oh, there's another one that's well, measurement, I would say, for how good a paint is light fastness. It's less of a metric or a property that I look for in markers because what this evaluates is the longevity of the paint. So how long it's going to last on your canvas. Because usually when you paint something, you hang it, right? And then it needs to weather through light and, you know, maybe sometimes even splatters of water or perfume or whatever it is, right? It's going to need to withstand, okay? But it's less of an issue when you are looking at markers because you usually use them in your sketchbook and you don't care too much about light affecting it because you don't open your sketchbook and display it on a daily basis. But if that is a measurement, then you would look at that property as well. So for these markers, I don't really see that measurement. So a lot of these properties, I needed to experiment it with them a little bit more in order to find out. But in today's video, I want to share with you my findings, and with those findings, how I choose to apply in using them in my sketchbook. Okay, so one of the things right off the bat you can notice is because I started drawing with them in my sketchbook, the page did warp, right? As mentioned in the last video as well, this is not a problem if you're using thicker paper, right? The more absorbent type of paper. But because the Talens Art Creation sketchbook is a little bit on the thin side, okay? So usually when I do marker applications, unless it's a highlighter where it's like a very light wash, the paper doesn't really get affected. But when you are using paint markers that emit more water, right, to the page, it does warp the page, as you can see. Especially I did front and back, so I definitely noticed warping happening. But it's minimal, I would say in the acceptable range. Because acrylic paint is not all opaque, and this marker set, so I received 2 marker sets, and in both of these 2 sets, I noticed that the markers are not all equal. They don't exhibit the same consistent opaqueness nor translucency, and the drying time also varies as well. So as you can see, I've swatched out all the colors here for both of these 2 marker sets. Some of the colors are definitely more opaque than others. These few are more on the transparent side. Again, it's the blue colors, right, that I mentioned earlier. Same with the greens, right? You can clearly see this one is more of a wash compared to this green color is a lot more opaque because there's probably more white added to it. Same with this one. These are more opaque compared to these lighter shade, the lime greens, as you can see. These blues, this purple, more transparent, more of a glaze color, more like watercolor even, right? Compared to some of the others that definitely has some white added to it. I'm really surprised by this color. This color usually is not very opaque, but it is very, very opaque from this marker set. So that's a color that I quite enjoy using. It also, the transparent or glaze effect, I also noticed in some of the pinks, right? As you can see, these colors are fairly transparent, but this one, extremely opaque, right? This one, opaque, opaque. And this one is a bit in between. These are a little bit in between as well. But I think with multiple layers, you can make them more opaque. This one is very opaque because clearly this red has some white added to it. So it made it really opaque. And this one is less opaque. Same with these colors, right? Like they're all, I'm not gonna go over them one by one, but you can see what I mean by the transparency versus opaqueness of these markers. So how does it affect the application? Well, one of the things that I do is I try to limit a color set that I use on each one of these paintings. And the reason I do that is because you don't know whether the markers that you choose to use are going to be opaque or transparent, and you don't want that to affect your painting too much. My time is really limited. I do these 20 to 30 minute drawing sessions, and I wouldn't want to do a swatch every single time. So keeping a limited color palette or a set of markers to use allowed me to get to know the properties of the markers and work within that limit. And then the other thing I do is I tend to choose colors that I know I'm going to be using for the face in a light to dark range, right? So as you can see, this one, the markers that I chose, I noticed that they're all fairly transparent, okay? So each one of the markers, besides this green color, is fairly glazy type of application, right? So none of them is completely transparent. So the way that I apply the markers is more as if it's a watercolor marker, okay? Or more of as if it's a water-based pigment marker, where I did definitely more mixing, right? And layering. And I didn't really create like clear marks or patches because I knew it's more glaze. And in this one, most of it is also, besides the darker color, it's also more watercolor based. And in fact, I left a lot of the paper behind as well because I didn't want it to look too heavily painted. So this one, I would say it's a mixture of both opaque and transparent, right? This one is more opaque, right? As you can see, all the colors, with the exception of perhaps this lighter shade of purple, is fairly opaque. So the style of this drawing, I would say, is quite different compared to some of the others. This one I did a tutorial on, a step-by-step tutorial in a short. These green colors are more opaque than others, but because the colors I chose are fairly similar in range, I was still able to create some of a transition between light to dark. Same with the pinks. And sometimes the markers do mix a little bit before you, if you start applying it before the previous colors dried, you will dirty the markers a little bit, but the benefit of that is also you can create some of the mixing directly on in place of your drawing as well. A lot of the lighter shades are more transparent, so I tend to apply lighter shades last to create a bit of a glaze effect. And for the background, I almost always try to choose a opaque color so that I can override some of the mistakes that I made with the first sketch. As you can see, I try to cover up some of my mistakes with opaque wash of color. This one is so opaque that you can't even see anymore, but my original lines were not this nice for her face, and I covered up a lot of that with the green background. This one, although it's a lighter shade and it's not nearly as opaque as I would like, I was still able to, with multiple layers, cover up some of the mistakes. So what this allows me to do is essentially to be more free, right? I don't start these drawings with a pencil sketch. I just go for it because I feel like even if I make a mistake, I can cover it up with another marker. It's not end of the world. And I quite like that. I like to draw freely and not be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you're supposed to draw in your sketchbook anyway. And also live your life. Don't be afraid to fail and make mistakes. This was my first sketch in the Talens Art Creation sketchbook, and in this one, I feel like I was still experimenting. I didn't really come up with a plan or anything, and I just started to go for it. So there were a lot of experimentation. I wasn't sure how light or dark some of these colors are going to be because I was still getting used to the pigment and how I might use it in this sketchbook. So I was a lot more hesitant. I think I didn't really complete this in like 20 minutes or anything like that because I didn't really go in with a plan. I certainly didn't choose a set of markers to limit myself in using, and I made a lot of mistakes. For example, I think this yellow marker didn't really go with the color palette that I was going for. And the paint color that I chose was also too pink, and it didn't really go that well with the dominant red color that I'm choosing as the hair color and outline color. So started with the second one, I was a lot more systematic. Before drawing this sketch, I actually picked a set color, and I purposefully started with a mid-tone color to apply as a whole wash to draw out my first draft. And then the second thing I did is I went in with a dominant color, the darkest shade, because I knew this is the color that I was going to use for the outline. And this is probably going to be the color that most people see because it's the darkest. And I used this for a lot of the details that I was making. And you can also tell that all the colors that I used in this sketch, they're kind of within the same family, ranging from light to dark. And that was certainly intentional, right? Because I wanted to use the same color family because I know that these colors are going to work well with one another. And when I shade in the colors, it's going to create a bit of a harmony effect. So the one thing that I didn't notice is, I didn't really plan for, is how this paint color doesn't really, it doesn't really match with the rest of the purple colors. So instead, I used it more of a glaze effect. And then for the background color, I chose something that's complementary to the purple color. In the end, I added some more details with this pink color because I feel like it added a little bit of a nice touch. And also because it went better with the highlight light pale pink color. So in the third one, I would say I kind of was in a playful mode when I started this one. I didn't pick a lot of colors to begin with. I think I picked like 3 different greens for his face. And I made a lot of mistakes in the initial sketch as well. As you can see, it doesn't quite look like a person even. I mean, it just didn't really look that great. But I went in with a light shade. In this case, this light shade is more of the mid shade because I intentionally left the highlights blank. And that's when I started going in to fix up his face. And here I chose a purple color, which is, it kind of just pops, right? I'm still in the experimentation phase, I would say, for this one because I didn't really know how opaque or how translucent some of these markers are. As you can clearly tell, the lime green shade is more of like a glaze effect, whereas some of these other colors, for example, the red and the purple, they're so opaque. Like as soon as you put it on paper, it just covers up everything. Whereas the lightest shade, that minty green color, it's not really all that opaque. This fourth portrait is probably one of my least favorite ones because I didn't quite get the face proportion right. However, I did really enjoy drawing with these blue colors. And I feel like I actually made some of the best transitions in this portrait, even though I didn't really get the expression nor the proportion correct. I did enjoy how I used the combination of colors in this one. And I think I did a better job of mixing the transparent colors and the and the opaque shades. I became better at mixing them. So here I'm just wondering why some of these colors are more opaque compared to others. But for the ones that are just not as opaque, I can fix it by going over it multiple times. So it's not that big of a deal. In this one, all the colors I chose, I noticed very quickly were super transparent. They're almost like like my Faber-Castell pens. So it didn't really feel all that acrylic like. The blue and this darker green is more opaque. But, starting with the actual face, this blue color, that purple first color, like the initial purple color, they were all extremely light, right? This pink color as well, it doesn't cover up anything. So I kind of made a different kind of, I made a decision to just use it as if it's watercolor and just glaze through everything, because I know all the previous colors are going to show through. Kind of like a stained glass effect, if you will. And then in the end, I added details with some darker shade to give her eyes a little bit of a pop. This reference photo I've used multiple times already. I actually drew her in pencil in the same sketchbook as well as in marker when I was first trying out these marker set in my Ohuhu sketchbook. I quite like the reference photo because it's really simple. And in this example, I also experimented quite a bit, because at this point, I realized that not all markers are born equal. They are quite different. So I developed the habit to swatch it out a little bit before I put it into my sketchbook portrait. So as here, you can see that I know that, these two colors don't really mix all that well. The brown is super opaque, whereas the, I would say, like pale pink color is very non-pigmented, so I kind of just smudged them together. This one is a classic example of where I'm mixing the opaque and the transparent markers together. In this one, the initial sketch, I made a ton of mistakes, as you can see. The neck and the face are just not correct, so I ended up using some other colors that I knew are opaque to go in and fix it. I also applied the background so that I can get the neck angle correctly. So the initial few tries were all made by fixing the sketch, which is okay. Again, like, you're supposed to make mistakes. Not everything is going to turn out perfect the first time you try it, and that's okay. You're here to fail. You're here to experiment. That's what Sketchbook is for. Not every sketch is going to turn out to be perfect. And that's how we learn. If every single thing you draw is a masterpiece, what's the fun in that? You're never going to learn something new. So always push the boundary and try something new and, hope for the best. And if it doesn't turn out really great, that's all okay as well. So this one is my least favorite out of the batch. And it's just because, again, I went in without a plan. I used a bunch of colors that don't really go with one another. They don't belong in the same family. I kind of just picked them because I wanted to try it out. As soon as I pick up like a black color, you know that I'm frustrated. I kind of just gave up on making it look better at that point. So this one I think is a better one compared to the blue one that I was making. All the colors are fairly opaque with the exception of the lightest shade. And it's kind of, it got this pop-up art effect or illustration type of effect that I actually quite enjoy. At this point, I realized the white is too white and I needed to soften it a little bit, and in the refinement stage, I kind of toned it down a little bit more. And I also did notice that some of the colors do peel the paper a little bit, so you really do have to be careful. So with this sketch, I actually made a short tutorial called 5 Steps to Draw with Acrylic Markers. And I essentially summarized my process into 5 steps. And step 1 is essentially pick a small set of colors from light to dark. I already mentioned this before. That process I find to be the easiest because then you're not learning all, I don't know, however many markers there are. You're just having a limited set to work with. That becomes a lot easier. And then the step 2 is you start with a mid-tone shade to create a blueprint. And you've seen this over and over with all these sketches. That's what I like to do. I don't use the lightest shade nor the darkest shade, but I make kind of a draft with a medium shade color, right? And that allows me to then go in with a dark shade. So step 3 is use the darkest shade or a dark shade to just fill in all the shadows and go over your imperfections to refine and fix up your preliminary sketch. Because your preliminary sketch will have mistakes, and it's okay to have mistakes. Embrace those mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes become part of the drawing, sometimes they don't. So you just cover them up, and that's okay because acrylic is very forgiving. And then step 4 is when I choose, the colors from dark to light, and then I try to leave the highlights empty. Sometimes I do go back and forth with these markers to, focus on one area and finish that before going to the next shade. But sometimes I just use, a dark to light process and cover up the whole face. And the reason I like to go from dark to light is because it's a lot easier with acrylic to add in the highlights because the highlights are mostly more of a glaze effect. So there you have it. It's like these simple steps. So the last step I forgot to mention is where I add details and background, and that's the most fun stage of the drawing. Sometimes a lot of the drawing is in that stage, right? That's where you make the drawing pop. That's where you add in the special sauce, the special character of your drawing, right? Maybe it's adding a star, a heart. Maybe it's adding some makeup to her eyes or adding a hairpin or something, right? Something to make the drawing a little bit more interesting and can be more creative about it. But I usually almost certainly leave that till the end. You gotta make sure you got the drawing 80-90% there, right? And then you add in the details. So for me, a lot of times that detail is a little bit of a background, right? It doesn't always have to be. I sometimes leave the background, but if I'm doing a painting, I almost always paint the background. I would feel the drawing is incomplete without a background if I'm doing a painting. I remember I drew this drawing on Valentine's Day. I really like this character. She's from the show Wednesday. I thought the actress did a really great job portraying her, and I really enjoy watching that, binge watching the TV show. And I look forward to seeing the season 2. I heard that it's coming soon. So again, following the steps, step 1, I picked out a bunch of green colors that are similar in value, and I started with a mid-tone to create a blueprint sketch. And I know this step is not going to be perfect. Right off the bat, after I put down her eyebrows, I realized the eyebrows a little bit too high up, but that's okay. I know I can go back in with another shade to fix it. I also really enjoy drawing this portrait. Somehow, I know the reference photo wasn't her, but you know, the final drawing reminded me of She-Hulk, the character. I think it's really the color and the fact that I probably made the model's eyes a little bit bigger than they really were. And that tends to happen, right? When you are using a marker that's a little bit thicker, you tend to exaggerate all the features because, you know, if you're drawing a portrait, what are you really drawing? You're drawing the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And if you're using a marker that has a thicker tip, you tend to make the features a little bit bigger. There are some colors that I really like to use together. I feel like these color combinations just go really well with one another. Most of the times though, when it comes to color selection, I tend to go for complementary colors, right? So if you look at the color wheel, the colors that are on opposite ends. And the reason I do that is because naturally I know these colors are going to pop against one another. So you not only notice one of the colors, but you notice the other color as well. And that kind of juxtaposition creates a really interesting statement as soon as it draws the eyes, essentially. As soon as you look at it, you feel that immediate visual impact. But sometimes, you know, for example, if I don't want them to fight with one another, instead I want one of the things to really stand out, then what I'll do is I will downplay the other color. I'll make sure that that color isn't as impactful. And how do you do that? Well, all the colors that you see, right, whether it's from a set or from a tube, there's a kind of a scale of vibrancy, and typically the more close they are to the primary colors, the more vibrant they are, right? There's also a way to tell how bright these colors are, right? Like when we think about highlighters, right? What makes a highlighters really pop? It's because those pigment are designed to really pop on the page, right? So if you're looking for a color that you don't want to be the statement piece, you want it to settle to the background, you can mute it. You can mute the color by adding white or gray, right? But if you want the color to really pop, right, doesn't matter what color it is, you either use what I mentioned earlier, which is that complementary effect, or you use a color that's extremely bright, high in luminosity, vibrancy, right? Those are the kind of like highlighter shades, right? Or you pick something that's a primary color. Primary colors tend to pop as well. As you can see here, although this green, I would say, isn't really high in value, as in it's not really that light, right? But because it's so vibrant, it jumps out at you. So it works as a highlighter. Because in this case, although I'm using the lime green on her face as a highlighter, and there's some pockets of white that I applied, washes of white that I apply as highlight, I am also using that shade of green as a highlight to complement that side of her face. Overall, because I've been drawing with these markers on a daily basis in the last little while, I have learned so much about how to use them. And through my learnings, I have summarized a few key points. Number one is, before your portrait study, make sure you select a fixed set of colors, because that is really going to help ground your picture that you're making. The second thing is, watch out for the drying time, because they do vary between marker to marker. Some of the markers are more opaque compared to others. Some of them are better for glazing. And lastly, I would say embrace your mistakes. Be confident with your lines. Enjoy drawing, and thanks for watching.